I'm JJ Heller, and this is Instrumental, a show about the big and small moments that shape our lives. In every episode, my guest and I start near the end of their story and work our way back to the beginning. I hope our conversation reminds you that every second matters, because none of us knows which moment will be the one that changes everything.
Big love happens in the small moments.
Hello,
Everybody,
this
is
JJ
Heller
and
Dave
Heller.
and
We
are
hosting
a
podcast
called
Instrumental. Nailed that.
Yes.
We have such a rich episode for you.
I'm so glad that you guys get to hear Don Chaffer's story today. So Don and his wife Lori are in a band called Waterdeep. You had one of their records, right, JJ?
Yeah, I had my roommate in college had their collaboration record called Enter the Worship Circle.
This is back in the late 90s.
Yeah, this was like 1999.
And they were a big deal
I know.
in the college circuit.
Yeah, we wore that CD out
How do you wear a CD out?
just by playing it over and over.
But it's just like there's a light shining on it. The light goes all the way through it eventually.
Yeah.
Gets thinner.
It shines so brightly that it makes the CD see through.
It makes the CD wear out.
Yes. Or we wore it out, meaning we pinned it to our clothing and wore it when we went out. We wore it out.
Amazing.
Yes. It was trendsetters.
Wait, did you wear it like a button or a tie, necktie?
A little brooch. Waterdeep brooch.
Wore it out.
This conversation with Don was unlike any other we've had to date. We do want to let you know that his story is fairly intense. It touches on alcoholism and suicide. So if those are triggers for you, this might not be a great episode to listen to.
And with that, we're going to get started.
Act 3, things have definitely improved. As you will soon hear, Don's life is not without significant tragedy. Over the years, he's been able to process his grief through his creativity, but he's also benefited from medication. I will let Don explain.
I found out that I was ADD, which was probably surprising to nobody else. And then that I was also initially they prescribed a psychiatrist prescribed me Adderall, and it's been a miracle drug for me. Partly because I was hitting this point where weekends I would work really hard, 50 and 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks on producing records and stuff. And then I would crash on the weekends where I was depressed, not just tired. So I went in to see the psychiatrist. He said, if you think of ADD as like a conductor at a podium and he's trying to conduct the orchestra, but all the sections are a little out of time with each other. And so he's just trying to give the sharpest beats he can give to try to keep everybody in line. He said, that's what you're doing all week. And then at the end of the week, you crash and you're exhausted and grumpy and sad and all these things. And I remember thinking, I have to do something about this because I don't want to be this kind of person. So he gave me this stuff and it was amazing. And then after about, a month or two of ramping up and getting used to it, the medicine, I started having still some of the dysthymia is what they call it, which is kind of mild depression. And then they eventually prescribed me some Lexapro. So I'm on a milder dose of that. And one time I was talking to my wife about 2 years into it, taking meds. I said, sometimes I wonder if I should just see what it's like without them. I mean, do you think things have improved? And she's kind of barely, I finished the sentence. Yes, things have definitely improved. Please don't do what you got to do, but just know that things definitely improved. So. My best friend from the second grade that I still am in touch with on a regular basis, his name's Aaron Altman. We were best friends in second grade in St. Charles, and then we roomed together at Kansas University in college He said to me at one point, you know how when Elvis came around, a bunch of people became rock and roll musicians? And so you got people like Bob Dylan that might have been a poet becomes, a rock and roller, or you got whatever, all these people. And he said, I wonder if maybe you were always really a writer or a storyteller and you got into music because of Bob Dylan, actually. And I just think maybe you shouldn't underestimate that part of your life. And that's what inspired me to write the first musical that I did, where I did all the book music and lyrics. It was called The Almost Unforgettable Edwin Booth, about John Wilkes Booth's brother. That idea of being a storyteller / kind of poet that also does music, it's something that I want to make sure is part of my life, the storytelling piece, that I lean into that. It's been interesting, actually, even in the course of, we did this interview over a couple different days, and last night I revisited this memoir that I had started a while back about my dad, called The Seven Last Words of Jesus and/or My Father. And it's kind of about the last moments that I connected with him. And I started working on it again because I just being kind of soaking in the story again. I was like, yeah, that's right. I feel a lot of feelings. And I also have a lot to say. And maybe it's better to start writing it instead of just having to call the Hellers every week. And just, no, I'm just kidding. So I don't know. I think the future is more stories, more poems, and then probably a lot of it set to music.
After his father's death by suicide, Don processed his grief by creating first a record, and then he transformed that album into a musical called Son of a Gun. I had this to ask him. With the musical that you wrote, are there faith elements involved in that?
Oh yeah. So there's a cowboy Jesus, and he has two angels, and he keeps showing up throughout the thing. It actually culminates in a duel between Cowboy Jesus and Danderholler. What happens is they go to a practice duel because Danderholler wants to duel his father, who has died. In the second act, he decides he's going to have a duel with him. This is all pre-Hamilton, by the way. So Cowboy Jesus says he'll be the second. He'll set up the duel for him. And he goes, now let's walk it through. And you're going to take your 10 steps. And you turn, and then Cowboy Jesus shoots him. And he looks at the gun. He actually says, well, son of a gun, that wasn't supposed to happen. And he goes, I'll be right back. And he runs off. And then while Danderholler's bleeding out, he's been shot in the stomach, his father comes out. And they finally talk it all out. And when the dad finds out that they were supposed to duel, that he was supposed to duel him, he says, well, let's do it. He says, why would I shoot you? And he's like, well, I'm dead already. I can't figure it'll hurt me that bad. So then he shoots the dad. And now that they're both bleeding to death, he asks his dad all these questions, like, why did you do this? And why did you do that? And when the dad answers, by this point, he's kind of alienated his wife, who we got to watch him fall in love with and marry her. He's alienated all these people in his life. When the dad says, well, I was afraid and I did this because of whatever, the son says, I know that feeling all too well. So he recognizes himself and his father. And then he says, right at the very end, he says, I forgive you. So
Wow.
then right after that is the climax. At the end of that scene is that. Then Cowboy Jesus shows back in with this rusty pair of pliers. He goes, so do you want me to leave it in or dig it out? And that's his big Cowboy Jesus number, is leave it in or dig it out. And Danderholler decides to dig it out to live. And so he digs it out and he screams, and then it flashes forward, and we end with him back on the road with his wife and the brother. They're in a family band. So they're back on the road and they sing this, what's the song? Love is always worth the fighting for. That's the line. That's the last song. So,
Oh my gosh.
It's amazing.
Chills.
No matter how it freezes, no matter how it burns, love is always worth the fighting for. Oh, love is always worth.
Musical theater can be so powerful, like to help someone feel feelings and get inside a character's head, right?
Yeah, I'm a fan.
Have you had any firsthand experience acting in musical theater, JJ?
Yes, I have, Dave.
What did you do?
Okay, when I was in 6th grade, the high school that was connected with my middle school was putting on a performance. It was like a musical version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And they needed some younger people to play like the younger characters. So I auditioned and I got the role of Lucy.
Oh, I bet you made an awesome Lucy.
It was so fun. I loved it. And what's funny is like it happened such a long time ago that it's almost like I have memories of being in Narnia.
What was it like?
One of the reasons why we named our daughter Lucy, because I just have such affection for that character.
That's cool. I just want to give one more warning before we jump into Act 2 that this is a very intense story and deals with suicide. So just know this conversation is not necessarily appropriate for small children.
Act 2, not unscarred, but healed. Like many of us, Don had a complicated relationship with his father. Don picks up the story before he was even born.
He was an alcoholic all of my life. He had been a fighter pilot in Vietnam and suffered PTSD. He was shot down at one point and rescued. We have recordings of the rescue because the guy that ran the observatory plane had a black box that somehow they got a hold of. So, and I actually heard it with him. In fact, at one point you hear this emergency thing go off. When you punch out of a fighter, it automatically starts broadcasting like a beep, 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 like an emergency thing on the radio.
Okay.
Until presumably it stops at some point, probably because the plane hits the ground. Right? But my dad punched out.
Does that mean he ejected from the plane?
He ejected and then parachuted down. It was in Vietnam, and he was providing air support for a land fight with the North Vietnamese, right? So they turned their guns on him and shot him down. And then he punched out and landed a half mile on the enemy side.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So my dad's handle was Blade 1, and Smokey is the observational plane that's circling overhead. And then he eventually, this Army helicopter touches down in a clearing on the enemy side.
Okay, roger that. Blade 01, we got a chopper flying right over you now. Do you hear him? Roger, Smokey, he hears. Okay, Warlord, he's going to put up a flare if you'll come back into this general area on the southern edge of this big LZ. Oh, roger that.
And it's what they'd call a hot zone, right? Like, this is a dangerous pickup.
Hey, Warlord Smoke, let me know if you're taking fire, babe. I'll hold down that area for you.
My dad has to run from the trees into the chopper, and there's a big silence at that point. And
okay, Smokey, I'm coming out due west, babe. I'm coming out due west. Negative fire, negative fire.
and the guy says, Roger, I got him. He's like you can hear the chopper planes. He's like, I got him. He can run like a son of a bitch.
Roger that. Real fine, Warlord. You do outstanding work, babe. Thank you, Smokey.
Warlord, the chopper pilot, says, anytime for a fighter pilot.
Wow.
Wow.
It's pretty explosive when you eject from a plane, and it jacked his back up. He got a Purple Heart from the thing, and he ended up having to have a couple of vertebrae fused. And he was fully functional, but he definitely had back issues for the rest of his life. He had all the telltale signs when he came back from Vietnam. He did 2 tours over there. That was the second one. And then when he came back, he would wake up screaming and sweating and all that kind of thing.
So
Yeah.
do you remember that from when you were a kid?
I don't, because I wasn't born yet. I was born in 72 and he came back in 69. So it was my older 2 brothers. And they are 9 and 12 years older than me. So
Wow.
they would have been 9 and 6. And then my sister was adopted. She's 18 months older than me because my parents couldn't have any more kids. And then it's not that uncommon, actually, that people adopt because they, quote, can't have kids, and then everything relaxes and then
Right.
they have a kid. So I was the surprise.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, it's Don.
My mom always called us the boys and the babes, as in,
The older and the younger.
yeah.
So do your brothers have memories of your dad waking up in the middle of the night screaming?
Yeah. And they also remember that he changed. He was more physically abusive and drank a lot more. And by the time I was coming of age, I always feared him, but he never was physically abusive to me. But I think it was a pretty rough period there, especially at the beginning, but I don't think it ever went away. I think maybe he was drinking away a lot of the money and or gambling and or who knows what other illicit activities, because my mom ended up having to get a job. He also disappeared for a year. She had to hire a private investigator to find him.
What?
Somehow, miraculously, they stayed married for 44 years, but it was a pretty crazy time.
Wow.
So while he left our family and during kind of this flamboyant midlife crisis, and he had a gun. He was going to kill himself at a certain point.
Whoa.
And it was Easter. Golly, I never even thought about that part of it. And he was walking down the road and he heard a church singing hymns. And he heard an audible voice say that I'm not done with you yet. And so he had this significant kind of mystical moment, conversion experience. And he was never able to conquer the drinking. He was always kind of beset by that stuff.
In July of 2001, Don's mother died of leukemia. Later that year, his father decided to drive across the country. Don was 29 years old when his dad stumbled upon an unsettling discovery while visiting friends in California.
And he was brushing his teeth one morning, and his toothbrush slipped and hit under his tongue. And he said it was this jolt of pain, and he knew something was wrong. And it turned out he had like a half-inch to an inch sized tumor under his tongue. He sent an email out to kind of notify friends and family. He's like, well, I was, diagnosed with cancer. Of course, my wife died in July. And he goes, I'd cry out, why God, if I hadn't drunk enough alcohol to sink a battleship and started smoking at the age of 10. So there was no question. He also was a Listerine user. So even his mouthwash was a component, right? Because there was
So much alcohol?
Yeah. Well, so here's the crazy thing. So there were 2 doctors at KU Medical Center who were pretty advanced in this one area. So the first one would go in and remove the portion of the tongue that was affected, right? And you have to have clear margins, et cetera. Then the other one would go in and they would take tissue from the skin was from the wrist because of the high number of nerve endings. I think they take also some tissue from your leg or something, and they build a tongue and graft it on to the muscle.
What?
And it doesn't become muscle, but it's bizarre. It takes on certain characteristics over time. It's always non-muscle, so you're always kind of manipulating it from the back of your throat, but it took a while to get used to it and everything. So we moved in just before the surgery, and then we were there as he was recovering from it.
Were you already wanting to come off of the road? Or
No.
And so did you resent your dad for it? Or were you just kind
No.
of like, this is what I have to do, so I'm going to do it?
I think I felt that way. I just felt like, well, obviously, we're the only ones that can do this. Everybody else had kids. We didn't yet. We toured as a 3-piece that year without Lori. My dad let us stay with him for free. He didn't charge us rent. So that was kind of the arrangement. He had always been a great storyteller and was really the life of the party, And so the timbre of his voice changed. It was whinier. He got immediately older looking. He was way more wrinkled. Combined with PTSD, he had depression, and he was an alcoholic. He was sleeping 16, 18 hours a day at the beginning when he got out of surgery, right? He couldn't speak. He was all bandaged up. He had a tracheostomy where they put the hole in your throat so that you can breathe out of that, so that his mouth could heal. He couldn't take in any food or water. It took him time to learn to swallow and all that stuff. So one of the things that had to happen was we had to clean his trach, and I would do that. We had kind of a routine. He would lie on the bed and take his glasses off, put his knee up, and then put the other leg cross-legged on his knee, and lie back, and he'd close his eyes, and then I would clean it. And it was extremely intimate. For a kid whose dad wasn't around when I was little and who always kind of like wished I could be closer to him, this is like total fulfillment, right, of that longing. And the funny thing about parents and relationships like that is that the thing that you want the most always feels odd when you get it. If you haven't had it, it just feels weird.
Yeah. What do I do with it?
Right. What do I do with it? Or that's not enough. Or, is it enough? Or was this what I thought it would be? Or, it's like
Yeah.
all these complicated thoughts and feelings. But overall, we had so much time together and so many sessions of cleaning his trach, and we really grew close that last year. He also had lost his wife of 44 years, only 6 months before that
Wow.
by this point. So it was a rough half year, right? He also dropped about 50 pounds. He wasn't like obese, but he was heavy set, He said he hadn't been this thin since he was in the Air Force,
Wow.
right? And the nature of the surgery, they remove all your teeth.
Oh,
And his jaw functioned. I think they unhinged it or whatever during the surgery. But
Yikes.
so he was pretty jacked up, right?
Yeah.
And while we were living with him, he attempted to kill himself by drinking himself to death.
wow.
It told me that.
Wow.
Told me that's what he was doing. And so I went upstairs and talked to my wife and said, well, this is what he said he's doing. What do we think we do? And she said, I don't know, and I said, I think maybe what we do is we just wait for him to pass out and then take him to the hospital. And not a few minutes later, we hear this glump, and we go down there, and sure enough, he's out cold. And the two of us carry him into the car and drive him to the hospital and check him in. And then he was under observation for 72 hours or whatever with any attempt, suicide attempt. You do that.
What did that feel like?
Oh, I know that my brain, there's so many chemicals firing off, right, in your body when something like that's going on. But at the same time, I remember always feeling like in every one of these situations, like a sort of a calm and an ability to stay sort of present to what happens next. Well, I guess this is what we're going to do. But underneath all that, it's blind panic and fear and sadness and anger and all these things. And it's impossible to discern them literally for years. Like pick one from the next, right? Like you sort of work your way through all those different emotions over time. So he was able to drink by just putting it straight into his belly tube. So he had a feeding tube in his belly. My wife found she did not grow up in an alcoholic home and doesn't know about all these important no talk rules. That was sarcastic. She found a bottle of like something, Everclear or something, and she emptied it, smashed the bottle, and put the broken glass on the step coming into the house with a note on top of it said, "You're being an asshole to your family." It was a pretty baller move, really, but which was definitely more forward as far as confrontations go than any of us were doing with him.
So he comes home and he finds the note. And then what
was
happens?
his response?
Well, I don't know because I was upstairs with like 103-degree fever
Oh,
at the time.
goodness.
And so I hear yelling and I kind of hobble down the stairs and say, okay, I think this is important. What if, though, you guys take a break on this and we talk about it when I'm well? So for the next couple days while I was recuperating, they didn't speak to each other.
Wow.
And that's when I realized this wasn't going to work. The way I said it to my dad when I went in to talk to him is I said, look, I grew up with you as an alcoholic. That's fine, or it is what it is, but I don't want to drag my wife through that,
Yeah.
And so our deal is you have to either get help or we're going to have to move out. And he countered with the idea he said, I'll take the upstairs and I'll have an external entrance and you don't have to know if I'm coming or going. That way, if I'm on a bender, you don't have to know anything about it. And I was like, no, Dad, that's not a good solution.
Yeah. How is that better?
And so we moved out.
What did you anticipate was going to happen?
Well, I don't know. I know that I didn't think it all the way through, even though he'd already attempted once, and even though he would be alone and sort of unchecked. There was some sense of denial of kind of like, well, that's easy math, right? You have somebody who seems suicidal, who is now going to live alone. It's fairly likely that, that's going to happen.
Right.
I mean, I've been to counselors since I was 16, so off and on throughout my life. They pointed out, if you had stayed with him, he very likely would have killed himself in that upstairs apartment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
With you around. So if he was going to do it, he was going to do it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a matter, I guess, at some level of keeping him alive. And I think I probably knew that as well intuitively, right? So we moved in with him in January of '02. We stayed with him till December of '02. We bought our first house when we moved out. And then we went on a tour, the first tour that we'd done together in a year. It was great. We had a great tour. I talked to him one time on the phone, and I could tell he was drunk. And then we got home on Easter weekend, and it was Sunday. It was Easter. Some friends of ours had a Easter party, and it was really great. And it was so great to have been on the road, but also to be back. And we had a really good community around us. And it felt like, wow, this finally feels like, after years of doing these two things of touring and being home, both of them felt good. Felt like, okay, And then I got a call from my sister right after we got home from the party. And I picked it up and said, he is risen, which is he is risen indeed.
It's something that you say on Easter.
Right. And my sister was wailing. She said, Dad's dead. He killed himself. Jared found him. Her husband found him. And so obviously then everything, changed. And
Wow.
Is it really hard for you to experience Easter as a result?
Super. Yeah. The crazy thing is that the timeline ends up that he probably died around midnight, basically the morning of Good Friday. And then he was discovered on Easter Sunday, which is bizarre. It's, Easter, Holy Week has always been a brutal sort of holiday in the church, right? Because it celebrates the crucifixion of Christ, but it also ends with a pretty good, it's got a good ending.
Yeah.
And it had superimposed, we had this new timeline, right? Of
this is the day my dad died.
Right. This is the day he was found. So
what did this whole scenario do inside you?
It was definitely a rough period coming off of that, trying to figure out what sense to make of it. Both my parents died at 67, so they were both pretty young. My mother died of leukemia. My dad obviously died of suicide. And was, by the way, he was clear of cancer. They got it all. He was good to go. He may have had a resurgence. Who knows? But, they'd done all their full body scans and everything. And who knows what his lungs looked like. It could have been any minute.
Right. Because he was a smoker.
Right. So when people die, it's always hard. When they die at the end of a good life, it feels, I assume, fitting. There can even be a mercy to dying, right? Where they're in pain, they've had a good life, they feel at peace. They want to, the monks always pray this, right? Grant me a good death. So there is such a thing. When you have a life cut short, especially really short, but even in my mother's case, for example, that's painful. If it's gruesome, that's also painful because there's a traumatic aspect to it. She swelled up like toward the end there with like 50 pounds of water weight from edema and had bruising everywhere and it was unrecognizable. I remember having to focus on her hand because it was the one part that I could recognize,
Wow.
So that's hard. Then if you add suicide, this idea of the will to die, I feel like it's just a bad idea myself, but I also have a lot of compassion for people that choose that.
Yeah.
And I also obviously have a lot of compassion for people that survive it, the family members and friends and everything.
Right.
So if you've ever read any Frederick Buechner, writer, Christian books and stuff, his dad killed himself when he was 10. And at 80-something, he's still writing about his father and about that moment when, they discovered him. And was that 70 years later, right?
Yeah.
So it's a mark that doesn't go away. And I felt super guilty about it eventually. I remember actually the moment that I heard the news that he had killed himself, I think I even said to Lori, I'm not going to feel guilty for this. That was a good thing to say, I suppose, but it's easier said than done, right? Like, in other words, it's one thing to say you're not going to feel guilty, and it's another thing to pull it off. All that means is that you repress it for a while. Eventually, you got to deal with it, right? The complication about this is like when you're in an alcoholic home, typically what happens is everybody takes on a certain role. I was the good kid, which is one of the kind of archetypes that people play. And if I get good grades and if I do well in choir and if I do all these things, then our family will be healed in some way, right? It's the nature of a kind of the narcissism of children that they think that they can somehow fix the problems of their family by doing something. It's not always that scheme, the good kid scheme. There's also the rebel. There's also the whatever, there's different roles. But you organize your whole personality and your whole approach to life around that problem, right? And then at some point, maturity is saying, I'm not going to organize my life around this problem.
Yeah.
And I remember knowing this is the moment when my wife has had this big fight with him. Oh, wait a second. I have another life that isn't this, that I can choose to have goodness in that, or I can submit it to this darkness and agree to continue to play this kind of crazy game. And then to suggest that he get help and he be so against it that he proposed this weird
scheme.
Yeah, confirmed for me, yeah, this is dark and it is crazy and I do need to get out of here. So the conclusion that I kind of came to looking back now is that it was an impossible situation and I tried to do the best I could. Maybe there were things I could have done differently or better, but they wouldn't have changed the outcome is my conclusion.
Yeah, it's like the those movies where people keep reliving the same day and the inevitable always ends up happening.
Right, yeah. After my dad died and we have the funeral and everything, it's within a couple weeks, we discover that Lori is pregnant with our first child, Miles. So we've got a new house, a new baby on the way. My dad just took his life. We also decide, once we find out that we're having a kid, my dad was gone the majority of all of our lives, like literally 6 months at a time. When he was dealing arms in the Middle East when I was little, he was all over the place, gone a lot. So the moment we found out we were pregnant, I was like, I'm not going to do that. So we're getting off the road. It was just sort of reflexive. And I had an inheritance from my dad. I put it into studio gear and basically started producing records for a living. So it was a new career, new house, new baby, loss of a loved one.
Wow.
Blah, blah, blah. So it was a crazy bunch of changes. I would say that phase of my life was marked by sacrificing for others. And it was a really good thing, and it changed me and it matured me, eliminated the kids in particular, just kind of like stomp the selfishness out of you. It's almost this visceral, I mean, marriage does it too, but you argue. But with kids, there's no arguing with a baby. You're just, as my friend Brandon, our drummer, said, the biggest thing I could tell you is that you just have to realize you're not going to be the one calling the shots for a while.
That is so true.
And that was the best advice. I remember realizing I better take care of myself a little bit, or I don't know what is going to be left of me, right? Like,
Yeah.
It's real possible to just lose track of yourself. I got on a train in Kansas City with my bike. I didn't know where I was going to stay for the night. I just told Lori, I got to go have some time to myself. And I wrote a bunch of poems. Like, I didn't take anything but like one book and a journal.
Okay.
And then I had, underwear and deodorant or something. But I mean, it was like pretty minimal. Yeah. And I was only leaving for it was only for 2 days or something. It wasn't like, eternal. And the train ride from Kansas City to St. Louis is about 4 or 5 hours.
And had you ever done something like this before?
No, not really.
You just on a whim thought, I should get on my bike, ride to the train station, and go on this ride.
I knew I wanted to go to the Botanical Gardens, which is where my mom used to take my sister and I when we would fight a lot when we lived in St. Louis. So I went back to my home where I grew up. And
did you have just like happy memories of like the Botanical Gardens? It was just like, I need to go to this like healing place where I have like good feelings from my childhood.
Yeah. My mother would take my sister, we would get in these big arguments, and she would say that if we go to the Botanical Gardens, that the oxygen, she was convinced the oxygen from all the plants helped us. I think in reality, and it was funny being there, I remember that my sister and I would go, and pillage the fountain in the back of this one kind of secluded area where no one would see us. So we just rake in the pennies and we'd come back with our pockets like soaking wet, full of change, right? And but in retrospect, my mom wasn't with us when we were doing that. And this was like the 80s. And so you just turn your kids loose in public places and then,
Hope for the best.
Somebody else's problem.
yeah. Meet me back here at whatever. So I do think part of it was actually just getting rid of us, like having a place we could go.
Yeah, it's
where
safe.
she could get a minute to herself. Yeah, and it's safe. And it was safe. But also that it was really beautiful. And I do think that she had an instinct for beauty. And it did always, if only because we were fellow thieves, it did reunite my sister and I.
I love it.
I remember thinking, I'm going to write poetry when I go. And which I had done. I took poetry in college and have always written poems in addition to music, but haven't published many of them. I mean, a few of them. But so to do that was really like kind of an indulgence, right? Like it didn't have any economic point to it. It wasn't caring for my family by doing this. I was caring for myself. So we would go to the symphony in the park back in those days too. I remember that. It was always one of my favorite things to do. I would often fall asleep. I slept through the canons in the 1812 overture one time.
When you were a kid and you went with your mom?
Yeah, and my dad. I remember our whole family would go. I would have been before he even left, so maybe 7 or 8.
Okay.
So this is called What I Would Now Like to Imagine. I would like to imagine right now, sitting on a weathered bench in a flower garden, that we are all together again on our way to a symphony in the park. We have all of our teeth. Our skin bears no marks of any surgeries. We have neither lost nor gained too much weight. There are no machines attached to us, and we are all young. We will set out our blanket and lawn chairs, and I will ask if anyone wants to play soccer, and we will all say yes. We will not be too hungry, nor will we have just eaten and feel lightheaded after only a few minutes of play. We will get thirsty and hot and break to drink water, dribble it down our shirts and dump it on our heads. Someone, perhaps Mom, will have the idea to take off her shoes and socks and will walk in the fountain, cocking one eye all the while for someone who might come along and ruin our fun. No dancing in the fountain, please. But no one comes to say such a thing. This business with the fountain will break up the game of soccer, but I will be happy and not able to think of a better reason to break up a good game. Except perhaps to get frozen custard at Nick's, and Nick's will still be in business. Our laughter will sound when it happens like a man riding a horse on the other side of a patch of trees. Though he is hidden half of the time, now by a clump of leaves, now a limb, now a trunk, he is riding all the while, a thunder of hooves and flapping cloth. We will have forgiven one another so completely, without forgetting offenses, that to see one another's faces will be finally to understand what love is. This is how I like to imagine it will be.
It's beautiful.
Thanks.
What does reading that remind you of?
I remember looking out the window of the train and watching the river through the trees. It was hard to find the joy at that time. And yet, that little trip, it was so great just to have some room to breathe,
Yeah.
So when I was there, I stole a penny from the fountain and gave it to her as a Christmas
Did
gift.
you?
My sister.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that is just the best.
Yeah. So she's got it framed.
Does she?
It says stolen from the Missouri Botanical Garden fountain for you.
I just love that.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of feels like that's what that trip was. Like you going into the fountain and collecting all the pennies, like
Yeah.
looking for beauty and treasure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And I think I wound up healed, not unscarred, but healed. And I wound up with myself and my family. I didn't have to lose one or the other. And a lot of that healing was through the art and through the decision to go ahead and take space for myself, even though I wanted to continue to give of myself. that's when I started writing these songs that ended up on an album called The Krusty Brothers, which is this side project, and they're heavily fictionalized and real kind of electronic. We created an alter ego, Danderholler, Agamemnon, Krusty, and his brothers that were in this band, and this whole story. And then when I was writing those songs, it was really me working out a lot of this stuff with my dad. And part of the story of that family is that the dad killed himself. And it was pretty transparently me trying to sort this out.
Yeah.
And then after the record came out, we heard from this couple, Chris Craig Day and Steve Day in New York City. And she's a playwright. And he was, at the time, I was a director. He now runs an animation studio. And they said, we like your music and we think this could be a musical. Do you want to do that? And then we did a full production, what's called a showcase production in New York City off Broadway, which is a real thing. There's 3 contracts. There's a Broadway contract, which for the most part is about 400 seats and up. There's an off-Broadway, which is 400 down to 100, and then 99 and less is the off-Broadway.
Okay.
Gotcha.
And it has to do mostly with contracts with unions and how much you have to pay.
Oh my
and blah,
gosh,
blah, blah.
yeah.
So-
And it's like exorbitantly expensive, right?
Yes, yeah. And then we loaded in on the day of Hurricane Sandy.
Oh,
Goodness.
So the lights were off like below 30th Street. We were at 40th and 42nd and 9th or something on a building called Theater Row. So most of our press people didn't come, and that part was a little bit of a disappointment, but it was still amazing to have it done. And then I've written 7 or 8 more since then.
wow. So you like it?
I love it. And I love actors and directors and designers, and I love the theater. So the kind of zenith of Act 1 in the first show, which was called Son of a Gun, the dad kills himself by putting alcohol in his feeding tube. It's like literally straight.
Wow.
And my sweet sister, came out to see the show from Olathe, Kansas. We're kind of late, and we're like running through the back alleys of, New York City. She's never been before. And we get there just in time, and we're kind of like plopped down on the back row of a 99-seat theater, which is not very big. And when we get to that scene, she goes, he's gonna do it, isn't he? And I was like, I didn't tell you.
Oh, no.
I had forgotten to tell her.
Ah.
Poor girl. And so and we were both crying, but she had like a ring of tears around her t-shirt.
wow.
Okay, so I want to know what it felt like for you to write this musical and then to sit in the audience and watch as this actor takes his life by putting alcohol in his feeding tube.
It was pretty intense. I don't know if it's Aesop's fable where the lion gets the thorn in its paw. It felt a little bit like every time I watched it, every time we rehearsed, every time it was like tugging a little tiny bit more on this thing that was going to take a long time to get out, and there was no magical moment, but I do remember feeling like by the end of it, one of the things they say about recovering from PTSD, which I don't know that I had proper.
You were traumatized, though.
But I was definitely traumatized, yeah. But one of the things they say about it is that when they interview people who, like in the war, that go through similar experiences, the ones that don't talk about it and are traumatized kind of consistently, they'll tell exactly the same story 20 years later. The ones that go through something, the story changes. And there's an aspect of it that it begins to make sense in a new way, or it means something, or whatever. Sometimes even the details change. But the point is that your brain is rewiring, right? Like it's growing new pathways through these kind of burned out places that, telling the story over and over ended up being really therapeutic,
Well, and how interesting, I think, for you to sit there in the audience and watch this scene play out. And I just had the thought where you're there, but he does it anyway. It's kind of this idea that it was kind of inevitable.
Right. Huh. I never thought about that. That's good. Huh.
Going back to the thorn in the paw, Do you feel like that thorn has been removed, or do you feel like you're just always going to carry it?
Well, yeah. So I think it's been removed. I mean, I think like this, if you think of it in a, like, to really carry the metaphor out, the problem with a foreign body in your body is the chance of infection. I think that's been eliminated. But like all injuries like that, the scarring doesn't go away. And so, and I think depending, like if you have a broken bone or something, sometimes it's always sensitive, I think in a way, this is a story, the particular story that we're telling today is about the healing power of art, right? The idea that art can be used as a form of expression that not only draws things up and out like a thorn from a paw, but also creates then a bond between you and the people that are experiencing it with you that gives them words, images, tunes, pictures for them to deal with their own suffering. And it's that sharing that we do in the arts that's why it's a cliche to say that art is healing. It's because it really does heal, because the process of making it is a healing one for the maker when they're facing things that are really tragic like this. And then the process of receiving it from the observer is also healing insofar as you recognize you're sharing the planet with somebody that's been through things that are like you, and B, sometimes it can be the key that unlocks a door, right? Like there can be in a song or in a play or in whatever, a moment when you go, oh, that's what this is that I've been dealing with. And that's how I can survive it, or that's what sense I can make of it.
I absolutely love what Don just said about art, because it's exactly the way that you and I feel about the music that we make.
Yeah. It's a way to process your pain, but it's also a way to let people know that if they're experiencing pain, they're not alone.
That's right. And there's hope.
Well, that was certainly a lot to process. And I think it's time to transition into our final act of Don's story, which is actually his first act.
Which is slightly confusing.
But that's our format.
Nevertheless, we press on. Act 1, Full of Love. After graduating college in 1995 in his early 20s, Don had some major life decisions ahead of him. This act includes a letter to his father, a rejected marriage proposal, and a unique family tradition. The story begins as Don heads out to spend 3 days in a cabin by himself as he processes his future.
I just needed to get away and figure out, what am I doing? And being the zealous youth that I was, I also decided I would just go ahead and fast for the time that I was there. And I was skinny to begin with, but whatever the case, I fasted for 3 days and prayed a lot and journaled a ton. I'd had a conversation with my mother, I think before this, about that maybe I should tell Dad all the things that I'm mad at him about. And my mother, for as complicated as of character as she was very diplomatic sometimes, especially with me. She'd go, well, you could do that. Then there's a pause, and she goes, or you could write him a letter, about all the ways you think he's a good father. And I remember thinking, I have no idea what those would be. I had often said that I couldn't think of a thing my dad had taught me. And so, because he didn't teach me to throw a ball and, that kind of stuff is what I was thinking of. While I was there at the cabin, I started writing this list of things that I did learn from my father. And it was stuff like, I don't remember ever hearing him complain about work. He always did his job and kept all of the stresses and complications of that away from us. Another thing was I remember vividly taking him essays when I was in high school, in ninth grade in particular. I took him an essay I'd written and asked him if he could look it over for me, because he was a really great writer. And he read it and kind of like, grunting. And then he goes, this is good, buddy. And then he's just marking the crap out of it, just like, marking up all sorts of things. I remember him saying, to write a good essay, it's pretty simple. Tell him what you're going to tell him, and tell him what you told him. And anyway, so I really learned to communicate from him, and not only learned it, but I was motivated because he told me I was good at it. And so I was like, oh, well, then this is what I'll put my energy into, is this kind of communicating, And I think that was a key reality.
Well, I think that we should just take a moment to think about that. You've essentially made your career as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And your dad was a great communicator and was a motivating factor for you to write. And
by the time I was an adult, he was actually like a fan of the music that we made.
I love that.
He and my mother helped out. Like, he did the accounting and my mom did the order fulfillment when we were doing mail order stuff,
Wow.
She had a little stamp that said hand-packed by Don's mom. And my dad, I remember him writing this letter to the band about how things should be split up and what he thought. Anyway, I read it to him. They were living up in Indiana at the time, and he kind of teared up, which was extremely rare. And he said, that's about the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. So we were on an uptick, now that I think about it, from when I wrote that letter to him. I never thought about this, but I wonder if he felt like, oh, you actually think I'm a good dad. I got to think he thought he was terrible. And he wasn't so hot, in truth. But I mean, the basic mechanics of fatherhood, right? Like, he was missing some things for sure. You don't base your love for your parents off of their performance. You base it off of this core foundation of reality, that a child loves their father and their mother, I wonder if he permitted himself to be encouraging to me because he knew I would receive it. I wonder if he felt like, I can't afford to be encouraging to my kids because they'll think I'm trying to make up for something. But with me, maybe he felt like, oh, I can be encouraging because I know he will receive it and values it. So, but I think the big turning point was the letter. I think when I shared the letter with him, he realized I didn't only have negative thoughts of him, and that maybe I would receive encouragement from him and even affection, right?
Well, and I think there's so much power in words, and by you telling him that he was a good dad in these ways, maybe he started believing it a little bit, and then he started to act like a good dad.
Right. So I decided I was going to do music for a living. I wrote a letter to my dad that I went and read to him. That was kind of a big part of our relationship. And then Lori. It was a very crazy courtship, like involving a ring left at the riverside and all this crazy.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was all this stuff. Basically 5 years of me trying to convince her that she should fall in love with me. And then
Hang on. So does that mean that your proposals were rejected initially?
one of two. The second one, we went back to the same river, and it wasn't an expensive ring, I should clarify.
You were like, it didn't work the first time. Let's go back.
Yeah.
Same place.
And so, I mean, we knew we were going to get married by that point. We talked about it and everything.
Okay.
There was, I was officially going to propose. So I got down on one knee at the same riverside, and she said no as a joke, which was like, oh, okay, hilarious. She went, no, I'm kidding, yes. I was like, okay, that's forever seared into my brain.
How much time had passed between proposal 1 and proposal 2?
6 months.
Okay.
We were not dating, but she was going to let me take her out on some dates. And then we were going to see how it went. And
she was your girlfriend, but you were not her boyfriend.
Well, I would say we were neither. There was no boyfriend, girlfriend. There were just some dates. So,
just two random people going on some dates.
I went to her and I said, okay, so I've told you before that I said, it's been about 1.5 years since we've talked about our relationship. And don't worry, I'm not going to tell you that I have feelings for you or that I'm romantically attracted to you. I want to tell you that I'm madly in love with you and that I know that you have a hard time deciding on kind of major things like this. And so what I wanted to propose was that you let me take you out on some dates and see if I can't win your heart. So that was the setup.
Wow.
And she said yes. So I had flowers. It was a big to-do. So it was a grand gesture.
How is that different from any other date that somebody would,
Well, because hopefully the feeling is mutual.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
And what I said was, it's not on you. You don't have to worry about this being unfair to me if you're not sure how you feel. I'll take all the risk. You just give me a shot at it. So then she went off to like Kanakuk, which was this camp in Ozarks. So she was there working really hard. I wrote her letters every day at least. There were 29 letters in 26 days from me and 4 back. And the third one said,
Oh, gosh.
I mean, that wasn't bad. That was 1 a week, right? But
Yeah.
I'm just saying she was definitely way outpaced. And the third one said, underlined, you have to give up all hope. And then, so I wrote her a letter like, okay, well, I won't be like communicating anymore for a while because I can't handle this. As I dropped that, and I dropped that in the post office and went to my P.O. box, I got the 4th letter talking about, do you remember when we were under the tree and you held me? And I was like, what in the world, So that's when I went to go propose to her. I like picked up a silver ring, just a cheap thing, and drove down there, and then asked her to marry me. And basically what happened was she said no. And I had been, at that point in my life, I was pretty emotionally shut off, I'd say. And so I remember staring at the water at this river and thinking, Lord, if there's one time I wish I could cry, it would be now. I don't know why I thought that. I just felt like I wanted to let that out. And all of a sudden this dam burst and I just started weeping and she was holding me. And so then she said the moment that happened, her big thing was she could never marry somebody that didn't seem like they would ever break. And then when she saw that happen, she was kind of like, immediately sort of changed her mind. And then it took a few weeks. And then by that point, I was so wrung out. She stayed there. I drove home the next day. And then by the time I started actually hearing from friends that maybe her no was not so firm, and I was like, yeah, okay, cool. I just can't. I'm like, well, I was avoiding her, but I wasn't like mad. I was just kind of like pretty bare. I laid bare on it. So then she eventually said, I wish there was some way we could just start over and just date. And I was like, well, we could probably arrange that. So that was, it was in July, I think, that I proposed. And she said no. It was October when we started dating, March when we got engaged, June when we got married. So there you go. I mean, when I look back on that time, it's kind of remarkable. I walked out of this little 3-day thing with a vocation, and a vocation that it turns out I would do with my wife for the rest of my life, right? I mean, so far, 25 years on, we're still working together. And not only that she would be a partner, obviously in work, but in life, and that she would be by my side and through this terrible ordeal. And actually, it was actually, I think it was this year or last year, Lori really got emotional about my dad. She said, I feel weird being sad about this because he's your dad. And I said, well, he's A, your father-in-law, and B, you lived with him. I mean, you had a lot of time with him when I was on the road that year. There was just the two of you. Then she really started crying. I mean, in a good way, it's like, so she's been not only close to me, but part of my family, right? Like, I mean, that's obvious that your wife would be part of your family. But when you have a real dysfunctional family, it's not obvious. And there's plenty of relationships, I think, where people stay back a little bit. But she didn't do that. She was right in there. And he loved her to death, too. He really did.
Well, and I think back to even the like broken bottle on the step and her
Yeah.
leaving the note. That was actually an act of love.
Yeah.
Like, she didn't do that because she wanted to annoy him. She wanted to somehow.
She wanted something better for him.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think it was born from a lot of love and a belief that there's an unspoken belief that you could change if you want to, right? I really do think that was one of the things my dad, I know it was, that he ultimately, you know what? I was going to say he ultimately decided he couldn't change. I don't actually believe that. I believe that suicide happens to be famously the permanent answer to a temporary problem. And it's one act. It just happens to be an act that ends your life. But it doesn't mean that your whole life is determined by the suicide. So long story short, I just feel like she believed in him and he knew that. And that they had a really special relationship. He told me multiple times, he goes, I've told you before, buddy, the mere thought of having to work with your mother would cause me to break out in a cold sweat. But somehow you two managed to do it. So kudos to you. So it is amazing to look at that cabin, this little three-day stint in a cabin, and walk out with a profession and a wife and a relationship with my father that made our final chapter one that wasn't just full of despair, but was also full of love.
When your kids are your age, what do you hope that they say about you?
What I hope is that when the dust settles on my own life, that what's left are these memories of me as loving and as fun and as warm and supportive, not the darker stuff, right? Like, I know that's there. I'm doing the best I can to not let impatience rule the day or depression or those kinds of things, you know what I mean? Or even just my own sadness that I deal with from all this stuff at times. I hope that they, on balance, they say, oh, he was wonderful. He was warm and loving and sweet. You know, it's okay that they know I'm sad sometimes, but we actually have a little family tradition. We take this like a cookie tin sort of thing with index cards of the names of people that we know who have died, and each year we put in new cards for anybody that we lost that year. And that includes Lucy and Sweetie, our cats. It includes, you know, sometimes people, it's kind of an interesting thing because now we're at, I don't know, 25 cards or something like that, right, of people that we've lost. But when it comes time, you feel this thing of like, you want to remember these people. And so every year we take the cards and then we kind of deal them out, and then everybody says the name as they put the card in to the tin, and then we bury it on Good Friday. And then on Easter Sunday, we dig it up and read the names again. That's been a really sweet thing, and we only forgot to dig it up once. I'm glad to say. It was like 2 weeks later, we go, you know, we never dug up anyway. And so they know that that's always a hard time for me, and they're really sweet about it. And parents are supposed to pour into their children, not the other way around, right? Like, it eventually, your kids can pour into you, sure, especially later in life, but you want to be a fount of affection, unconditional love for them. That's what I hope. I hope they feel like I did that, all things considered.
I think that's what every parent wants. We want a way to support and show love to our kids that will last in their memory even after we're gone.
Told you it was going to be good.
Yeah. Wow. We made it.
All the way to the beginning.
Yeah, that was a lot to process.
Yeah.
Don has lived quite a life.
Yes.
Should we recap?
Yes.
Okay. Here we go.
It's the final segment
That we like to call...
Let's Rewind the Tape. Don is a singer-songwriter and playwright with 6 musicals to his name.
But those musicals wouldn't exist if it weren't for an experimental album that was written after his creativity was reignited.
When he took a train ride to his hometown of St. Louis.
A trip he desperately needed in order to process the death of his parents.
Parents who supported his career in the arts,
which wouldn't exist if it weren't for a 3-day retreat at a cabin in the woods in 1995. One final note. If you or anyone that you love is considering suicide, please visit suicidepreventionlifeline.org.
To find out more about what Don is up to, visit donchaffer.com.
This episode of Instrumental was produced by me, JJ Heller.
And me, Dave Heller,
Our theme music is my song, Big Love, Small Moments.
that I helped write.
To find out more about me, listen to more of my songs, or watch my music videos, please visit jjheller.com. That's 2 letter J's, HELLER.com.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Instrumental.
So be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.